Hey, in this YouTube video, I'm going to review Excel Pivot Table Data Crunching 2013, this book right here. And you get the sample data from this link. It has all the different files from the book for free to download. So basically, I'm going to show you a lot of things in this video, like pivot tables, filters, slicers, pivot charts, pivot table relationships, similar to access relationships, and just basic, really nuanced details about pivot tables and pivot table caches. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to do like basic stuff. A pivot table is an automatic way of grouping columns and rows through customized filters and slicers to provide group statistics such as totals, running totals, differences, and counts of a group of items. It basically creates an interactive, customizable view of your data. So I'm just going to create a basic pivot table. I'm just going to click in chapter 2, and I'm going to hold shift and control and press down on the keyboard and then press right on the keyboard. And what that does is it selects all of the contiguous connected cells before there are any blanks. So I'm going to press insert on the ribbon, and I'm going to insert a pivot table, and I'm going to select new worksheet, and this is the range I just selected right here. You could also click here and then select the range. So right here is like the pivot table, and if you don't have this fields thing over here, you could just click here, and then that'll show, you click field list, and then it'll show the pivot table fields. So basically the values down here they calculate like the average, the count, or the sum. I could have multiple fields here, and count doesn't count blank rows. So if the row is, or the cell doesn't have any data, the count doesn't count it. And let's see, the rows is unique values that go down the left hand side of a pivot table, such as like product categories, names, or locations. And the columns is unique values that go across the top of the pivot table, and they're unique. It's the first row. It could be like months, periods, or years. And then I guess the filters are optional. You can filter by specific regions or days or whatever category you choose. So I'm going to build a pivot table right now with ship date as the filter, years as the column, product category as the rows, and the sales amount in the values down here. If you don't have sum down here, you can just click here and then click sum to get some of the values. And this basically, these are the rows right here, these are the columns right here. So the rows go on the left hand side up and down, and the columns are across the top like the headers, and then the values are basically what appear across the rows and the columns. And the filter, which is, I'll put up here, ship date. So you put a filter over here, and then you could select multiple items, and then if you unselect all, you could select, like, if you want to filter by particular months, you only want to see March and April across these years for these product categories, then you can do that too. Or you could just filter all of them. So that's how like the filter works. And I mean, every time you create a pivot table, it creates a pivot cache, which is a memory subsystem where the data source is duplicated and accessed by the pivot table. If you change the data in the data source, then you have to press data and refresh for the pivot table to update, or right click in the pivot and click refresh. So for example, I made this pivot table based on chapter 2 sample data. So say over here, if I were to just like change this to like 1 and change this to like 1. Notice how let's say like, yeah, so here's concession equipment. That's the product category. So I'll just change that by 1. And the concession equipment, it doesn't change, like the grand total is still the same as it was before. But when I press data and click refresh, now it updates. So the pivot table doesn't update until you click refresh when you adjust the data source. And if you actually like add data to like a new row or whatever, you just have to adjust your pivot table data source, which I'll show you how to do later, to include the extra rows and stuff. But an interesting thing is when you so basically if I were to create another pivot table over here, so I'm just going to do, let's say like I'm just going to adjust this. So notice how I'm going to take a screenshot of this over here just to illustrate this, because it's a pretty important concept for pivot caches. So here's the concession equipment right here. It's whatever this number is. Let me put a comma there. So this is the current number. So I'm actually going to change another concession equipment right here. Like I'll just change 2 of them. And I'm just going to create another pivot table with the same exact amount of rows and columns. I'm going to click insert pivot table. Alright, I'm just going to make the same exact pivot table that I made before. And let me put ship date years. So product category. So notice how it's the exact same number, even though I adjusted those 2 numbers down to 1. So it's the same exact number for concession equipment. That's because if you make a pivot table after you adjust the source data and you're using the exact same source data, so I use the same exact amount of rows and the same exact amount of columns in my second pivot table, since I use the same source data in pivot table 1 and pivot table 2, they both use the same pivot cache, because you don't want to, Excel automatically makes them use the same pivot cache. I'll show you later how to use a unique pivot cache if you select the same rows and columns, but it uses the same pivot cache to not use as much data. So basically it doesn't include like the updated data until you refresh it, because it's using the same pivot cache as the prior pivot cache that from the other pivot table. But when you click refresh, they'll both refresh. So it's like an important concept. Like if you change data, you have to click refresh for the data to change. And then also if you create a pivot table based off of the same source as another pivot table, then they both just share the same pivot cache. But say, for example, let me take a screenshot of the number now. And then I'll go back to the sample data and I'll just select I'll select less rows and columns, and I'll click insert pivot table. Okay, so this pivot table uses a different pivot cache than like the initial one. So this one will actually this one actually uses the data at the time that you create it. So whatever I selected here, this is the data that is in here. But when I create the second pivot table, since I selected the same data source, which was everything, as the first pivot table, it uses the same pivot cache as the other one, and it didn't include the most updated data at that time. But this one did because it was a different pivot cache. So you have to be careful when working with multiple pivot tables. If you're and just keep in mind, like, pivot caches could change. So I mean, also, while you're creating pivot tables, an important thing to note is you basically shouldn't have any blank cells, because if you have blanks, it kind of, like, you can't have a blank column and make a pivot table. So say if I delete this and I try to insert a pivot table, well, in this case, so product category, see how it says product name? So in this case it worked because I was using the same pivot cache as before, because I selected all of the rows and all of the columns. So I was using the same pivot cache as before, but when I actually try to click refresh on this pivot table, it'll actually throw an error because the pivot table field name is not valid. So since it has like a blank column here, it can't refresh because you deleted a column. So you can't have any blank columns or rows when making a pivot table. But mostly columns. And if, like, say for example, let me just press Control-Z a few times. So say if your sales amount, if you have like a lot of just blank data here, you could just select the entire column here and then press Control-F and go to replace and just leave that blank and put a 0 there, and then press replace all, press OK. So that fills in all the blanks with zeros. And another way to do that is, let me just delete a few out. So then you could just select it again and then go to find and select, which is over here on the home tab on the ribbon. So you go to find and select, replace, and then leave that blank and replace all the blanks with 0. So that's how you could put zeros there before you make the pivot table. So if your data source actually expands, like say now I have like an extra row here, then if you want to expand your data source, you basically go over here to your pivot table and then click Analyze on the ribbon and go to Change Data Source, Update Rows and Columns. So over here, change data source, and then you basically just have to update to include the new rows and columns. So that's how you can adjust the pivot table data source. Just click in it, go to change data source under pivot analyze, and then change it. So if you go to pivot table, click options, and go to data, over here on refresh data when opening the file, you can click this. So say if you have at the end of the video I show you how to connect to outside sources like Access. So you can have the pivot tables refresh when you open the file automatically. So if you're pulling data from different sources and that different source has changed and you want it to just refresh when you open the Excel file, you can enable that by checking that there. So in Excel, a row field over here is limited to 1,048,576 unique rows, and the columns over here is limited to 16,384 columns. But I mean, obviously, you don't want to. It's impossible to like look across all these columns, so you wouldn't work with that many columns anyway. And I mean, Excel 2003 has even smaller memory capacity. So .xls is Excel 2003, which has a smaller memory capacity. And then .xlsx is the newer Excel files. So that's later than 2003. And that's basically what I just said, the 1,048,000 rows and the 16,000 columns. And if you try to save an Excel workbook with more columns or rows than Excel could handle, you'll actually get a pop-up from the compatibility checker pop-up, and it'll appear and it'll say you exceed the pivot table limitations when you're saving the workbook. So now I'm going to, what else can I do? Yeah, so I'm going to show you how to change like the number formatting. So click over here, go to value field settings, and I'm going to select number format down here. And I'm just going to select like numbers, and I'll leave 2 decimal points, and I'll press OK. So that's how you can change like the number formatting. Let me make it like currencies, I guess. You could have like multiple stuff in the rows. You're not limited to one, so you could do all the different markets and then all the different categories across all the different years. And then I guess you do like the markets across the years with like the product category up here. So you could do all the different categories for all the different markets. And you could like filter by a particular region. You could say like, I want only the north. And I mean, I'll go into like slicers and stuff later, which will speed up pivot table and pivot chart filters. So right now I'm going to show you slicers. So I'm going to go to insert, and so on pivot table analyze, you go to insert slicer. And I'm going to select region and market. And I'm going to put product category down here and then remove market. And I'll put market over here. Yeah, so here's my pivot table, region, product category, market, sum of sales. So right now everything's enabled, but let's say I click just Canada, North. Every time you click, it just clicks one, but if you hold control, you can click multiple for the slicer. So that's how that works. And you could also deselect certain ones. And over here on the slicer settings, you could do multiple columns in case if there are like too many names. So yeah, and I guess the ones that are grayed out are the ones that aren't a part of that particular thing. So like Chicago is probably a part of like the Midwest or the South. Yeah, the Midwest. So if I select Midwest, now Chicago, I could click that. Yeah. So basically, slicers are just like filters for your data. So let me just, like, so if I select like the Midwest, Canada, North, Northeast, then that enables like I could filter by the ones that aren't grayed out. So it's a quick way to just like filter stuff. And yeah, slicers, they can filter multiple pivot tables at once. So if you go to and you right click the slider and you go to report connections, so you could connect to the slicer to multiple pivot tables, and I'll show you that later in the video. But yeah, that's how you can see what connections it is. Like right now, this pivot table up here is the only pivot table it's connected to. So it's pivot table 3. But I'll show you how to connect it to multiple. So right now I'm just going to show you how to do a timeline slicer. So insert timeline, and I'm going to select ship date. So timelines are cool because, let me just expand this a little bit so it all fits on. It's a lot of time. But yeah, it has all the different years and stuff, and you could basically, let me just switch this to quarters so it fits on the screen. So you can like filter by just dragging, and it'll only be for whatever is highlighted. So 2006 to 2008 start is currently the filter. So you can work with time. This is a timeline slicer. It works with date columns, and you could switch to like years if you only want certain years. You could do months, days. So that's how those are useful. So let me see. If you want to change the pivot table data source, let me guess. I guess I'll just remove all the filters and slicers. All. Select all these. Yeah, when you do like data and refresh that I showed you before, all the data like refreshes the same way, and all the slicers will change with it. So if you want to force a new pivot table cache, even if you're using the same table, like even if I'm selecting like all of the rows and columns like I did before, if you want to force a new pivot table cache despite selecting the same thing, you can highlight it, press Alt DP, and then click Next. So I already highlighted the range here, so you don't need to highlight it, but you can highlight it now. And then basically click Yes here. So right now it's just telling me your report uses less memory if you based on the existing pivot table, which is used from the same data source. But I'm just going to click No, and then click Finish. So I basically created a new pivot table here that uses the same range, but it's a different pivot table cache. So this pivot table will update separately from the other pivot table despite using the same data source, and it just warns you because you'll be using more memory because you have different pivot table caches. So if you want to, let me go over here. So if you want to move a pivot table, you can click within the pivot table and then go to pivot table analyze and click move pivot table. And so I want to move this pivot table to a new worksheet. Press OK. Then it moves the pivot table to a new worksheet. So that's how you can move pivot tables from worksheet to worksheet. And so now I'm just going to go to a new chapter. I'm going to go to chapter 3. And let me close out chapter 2. Don't save. So I'm going to add, go to the data. I'm just going to make a pivot table. I'm going to put region in columns, sector, customer in rows, and sum of revenue and values. So notice how like there are a lot of like blanks here and stuff. And notice how when you create a pivot table, all the numbers are always in general number format. That's how it always is, regardless of how the data is before you do it. So I'm going to click in the pivot table, and I'm going to customize and design this pivot table. And I'm going to go to design, and over here I'm going to click this to open the gallery that has all 84 or 87 designs. And I'm just going to select this one, and I'm going to do like banded rows, banded columns, so I could visually make out what column and row goes with what. And let's see, I'm going to go to value field settings, and I'm going to go to number format to change the number formats again to make them all currencies. So now the numbers are formatted properly. And so I'm going to change how it shows the zeros. I'm going to right click and then go to pivot table options, and under layout and format I'm going to select for empty cells show 0. So I just filled in zeros there, so it's even easier to tell which column and which row correspond to what name, and etc. So I'm going to change the pivot table name here. So I'm going to go to pivot table analyze. Up here, if you just type in like total revenue, press enter. So that changed the pivot table name. And I could change like this to, I guess, total revenue. So you could like rename that stuff. So under design, I'm going to go to subtotals. So you can show subtotals for each of the different categories at the bottom and or the top of a group. And then we'll just turn off subtotals. And then Grandtotals, you could show for rows. So sum up Midwest, Northeast, South, West. Just sums up every row individually. Grandtotals, let me do off. Let me do on for columns. Let me just do off. On for columns. I don't see them. And then I guess report layout. I like to use the tabular layout because then it just pushes, like if you have 2 rows, it pushes the second row over a little bit. And then it kind of like separates your data. So you could filter the first row by whatever, and then you could filter the second row by whatever. So if you go to report layout and just do the tabular form, that enables you to separate the data a little bit, and like Tabular moves the subcategories over a column. And then if you go over here to repeat all item labels, it actually repeats all the item labels in the first column. So your data is kind of like formatted and how like a normal database table looks. So that's why I like the tabular layout. So if you insert blank rows, it just separates each thing and makes it easier to read if you need to read it. And then over here under analyze, you can click collapse fields, so it'll just collapse all the groups, and click expand so you can see all the fields. And I mean, if you need to, let me expand the field. If you need to, I guess, copy pivot table data and you want to paste it here so you can do separate math with it, you go over here and just paste special values, and then you have all the numbers, the raw data here. I actually show you how to add like calculated fields and items within the pivot table. So you could do math with each of the different columns, so it's kind of, you don't need to copy and paste columns separately. So I'm gonna, let me see, I'm gonna enable subtotals for rows, and right click, field settings, none. Yeah, so you can, I guess, remove like subtotals that way. So I'm going to add subtotals. Let me switch back to compact form, and subtotals at the bottom of the group. So you could go to like, actually let me go back to tabular form. So if you go over to custom, you could switch over to count, and you could show the count of each of the, like the communications count, and you can show the counts across each of the different regions and stuff. So you could switch it from like subtotals sum to subtotals count. So another thing over here is, I guess, instead of like this is like sum of revenue, you could do count of revenue, which counts how many unique cells there are, as long as it's not a blank. Do average, which averages, it divides the total amount by the total value. And then you got like the max, which gives you the biggest number, min, the smallest number, product, which I don't know, count numbers, which works like the Excel count formula. So it only counts numeric values. It doesn't count anything that isn't numeric. And then like standard deviation, which does like the sample size for a standard deviation. This does standard deviation for populations. It says variances for samples. It says variances for populations. You can watch my statistics video for more on that. And see, I'm going to create a table with region under rows, and so I'm just going to create a new table. I'm going to go to insert and pivot table, okay, with region under rows, and then I'm going to drag revenue to value 9 times. So now I have like revenue as like the values column like 9 times. So I'm going to show you like what each of these do. So value field settings, we'll do count. It's like how you could just, I guess, switch to like max and all this other stuff. So the show value as tab. So if you go over here to, instead of summarize values, you could do show values as. So that's like another tab there. So I guess like difference from shows the difference percent from the value. So I'm just going to do, I guess, difference from, and then I'll do like from Midwest, press OK. So like Midwest, it has no difference to itself, but Northeast has like 383,188 more revenue than them, and the South has 860,000 more. The West has 1.5 million less. So that's like what the difference from does. Let me go over here. You could like change like the column name to like difference from, so you could keep track of it. That's what like the show values as does. And then I guess I'll go over here to the 6th one, go to show values as, and I'll select percentage of Midwest. So this is 100% because it's the same thing. Let me just change this to percentage of. This is 22% more. This is 49% more. And this is 13% of the total. So it's 87% less. And then I guess value field, show value as. That's stupid. Like percentage of total. So like Midwest counts for 25%, Northeast counts for 31%. So if you do like 31.67 divided by 25.96, so that's that 22% because it's 22% bigger than the Midwest. That works for like the other one, like 38.8 divided by 25.96. So that one is 49.44% bigger, and it accounts for 38% of the total, and they all add up to 100%. And then I guess, let me change that name too. So then I guess this one is, we'll do percentage of parent total. And then let me just add a sector down here. So what this does is it shows the percentage of the consumer goods for each of the the total parent, whereas this one shows the total percentage of the Midwest, Northeast, South, and West. So this all adds up to 100%, but each of these percentage of parent get added up based on each of the sectors. So now I'm going to go to chapter 4, which has grouping, sorting, and filtering pivot tables. So I'm open that one and close this one. So I'm going to go to the data, and I'm just going to make a pivot table. And I'm going to put years and date over here, and region down here, and sum of revenue over here. So I'm going to click in here, go to analyze. I'm going to select up here for the years. I'm going to go to group selection, which enables you to group. So grouping, you can work with like quarters, years, months, days. So notice how when I try to change something, it gives me an error. That's because I'm using the same pivot cache for this pivot table as in this pivot table. So you have to keep pivot caches in mind while working with grouping data. So I'm just going to select slightly less rows. I'm just going to create a new pivot table. I'm just going to remake everything again, because grouping, it's just really annoying with years and date and region and sum of revenue. The grouping is really annoying. The above error happens while you're trying to change the grouping, because there are other pivot tables in the workbook with the same pivot cache. So if you select less rows, then you adjust the grouping by month and year, then it won't have any issues. So now I'll do months. So now it lets me do the grouping, because this is the original pivot table, because the other pivot table is already grouped by something else, so you can't change the grouping that conflicts with the other grouping. And let me, I guess, do group selection again. So say if you want to group by days, and number of days 7. So if you want like to group by weeks, basically by doing 7 days, then for the starting day you should select, like, for example, like 12/30/2014, so that it starts on Mondays. Because if you select the first day as a Monday, then your first day of the week will be Mondays. So that's how you could group by Mondays. So I'm going to make a new, let me just delete all this out. I'm going to put revenue and then count of customer. Over here. So I'm going to group by numeric fields, which is kind of like useful for binning stuff. So if you need to like bin by certain ranges. So I'm going to right click the numeric value, and I'm going to select group, And over here, for starting at, I'm going to put 0. Ending at, I'm going to put 30,000. And I'm going to group by 5,000. So it does like the counts by each of the ranges for the revenue. So revenue 0 to 4,999 is there 104 customers. If you double click here, you can see those 104 customers. I guess I could add in like another count of customers, do value field settings, and I could do like percentage of grand total. So you can see like what the percentage is. I'm going to do another example. So I'm going to do market, and then I'm going to select like a few, or I'll select like this one, Chicago and Houston. And then I'll go to analyze and group selection. So that added those 3 selections that I just did to group 1, and now they don't appear down here. So now I'm creating groups. So now I can go to like Atlanta, Charlotte, Cincinnati, and group selection. So that's group 2. So I just hold down the control on the keyboard, and I can select the different cities and then group them. And then I guess I could switch to design, then go to tabular form, and then I'll just push these over. Let me just remove subtotals, so it pushes all the names over. And then like I'll add revenue, go to sum, so I get the revenue by the groups, and you can just type over like just name this to like west, north, south, south. So that's how you can, and you can do like report layout, repeat all items. So that's how you could group different cities by regions. And then we could change like the name of it to like, oh yeah, you can't do something that already exists. So I'll do like area of US. So you have to select like a unique name if you rename it. So I'm going to do another thing. I'll do region, market, region, customer, and sum of revenue. And over here I'm going to click tabular. So tabular is useful because you can filter by like the different columns, and you could add subtotals, And you could also create like groupings. So over here, if I go to, now that I could create like different groups with subtotals. So you can make like groups that are part of groups with the tabular. So that's why that's useful. And you can rename these groups too. This would be like electronic, or just like basic codes. Food codes. Huge. Cars. So that's why tabular is useful, because you can group. So notice how all pivot tables are sorted in ascending order. So it's in alphabetical order: Midwest, Northeast, South, and West. And then down here it was like Citigroup, General Electric, IBM, JP Morgan. So it's always sorted from A to Z. But you can go to the data tab and then click over customer 2, and you could sort Z to A. So you could sort Z to A, which is the last backwards. You could sort alphabetically backwards, and then you could actually now I'm just going to make a new table. So I'm going to do products, switches to years. So on products across the years. And let's say over here, I'm just going to do like gizmo, widget, doodads, and gadget. So I'm going to go to File, Options, Advanced, scroll down to General, Edit Custom List. I'm going to do New List. And these are it has my selection over here. You click here and then select it. I'm going to click Add and press OK. So now the next time you go there, you have to click Import and then click OK. So it makes that's how you make the custom list then. Let me plug in my phone. And then so you can sort. Let's say go OK. So the next time I make a pivot table, that custom list I made, it'll actually sort the pivot table in that order. So gadget, gizmo, widget, and doodads. Let me see if it actually did that. Gadget, gizmo, widget, and doodads. Yeah, so it actually auto-sorted by that custom list that I had made when I made the pivot table the first time. So you can see how it automatically sorts. I'm not going to make another pivot table to demonstrate that, but you can delete custom list here, press OK. So now if I were to make a pivot table with that same product, it'll sort it in this particular order automatically. And explain filter. Alright, yeah, so now I'm just going to explain like the different filters over here. And I'm going to make a new pivot table. So I'm going to put customers under rows, and sum of revenue under values. Put sum of revenue. So here are the different filters. Label filters are for text. Value filters are for numbers. And then if you have a date column, it'll have date instead of whatever here. So you can filter by dates. Equals, doesn't equal, greater than, less than or equal to, between, two numbers, top 10. And then labels, you could have contains, which has like certain words. You could use the search bar here to filter. So you could do like whatever, and then you could select like all of the ones that have that in it, and so that's a quick way you could filter by a lot just by typing in the search bar. Let me add dates over here so I could show you the dates. So over here it has date filters. So you could filter by like Q1 or Q2, Q3, this year, next year, this quarter, etc. And let me make a new table. So I'm going to add sector, region, market, rep. And sum of revenue, sum of cost. So you have a lot of filters up here. So under analyze, if you go to options and under layout and format, you could change report filter fields to like 3. So it puts like 3 filters on each thing, and then it moves another one over there. So you could like move like where the pivot table filters appear. If you have like too many or you need less in certain areas. So I guess over here you could select like if you only want like consumer goods, financial, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, press OK. You can filter by that. That's how the multiple items works. So if you go to options, show report filter page, now it made a different page for each of the filters there. So what was I at? I was at over here. So show report filter page. So each of these filters I clicked OK, and it made new worksheets for each of the filters I had. So I had sector, region, market, and rep. So there I just showed all the different reps, and it made worksheets for all the different reps. If I go to show report filter page, markets, now I get all the different markets. So that's how you can generate all the different pages based on a particular filter really quickly. Let me create like let me do like a timeline slicer. Let me remove all these. Let me go over to here. Put like I want months and years. Just another thing using the same cache. So I'm just going to use years and date. And I'll put market over here and sum of revenue. So I'm going to insert a timeline with date. Press OK. So here's this slicer over here, and I'm just going to do that, like make like 3 of them. You can copy and paste like 3 of them, and I'll make like 1 of them for the years, 1 of them for quarters, 1 of them for months. So you can change a few different things at once. And then I'll also click over here inside the pivot table and then do insert slicer, and I'll do weekday. So you could select certain days for the pivot table, and then you could still use the slicers. And you could change like the color for some of them. So if you're like, you want different colors, do different colors. Now I'm going to go to sheet 10, and I don't have any columns here, so I'm going to go to view and click headings. So that brings back the columns. That's how you could hide the columns if you don't want people selecting columns and stuff. Yeah, and then go to, so there are pivot tables down here also, down low, and you basically select the entire pivot table in for like, first let me go over here. Let me just delete these. Delete. Just gonna delete all these other sheets and stuff. Let me just reopen this state. Yeah, because I had something filtered somewhere. So I'm just going to go to view and headings and enable everything again. So here's the pivot tables. What you basically did is I highlighted this, I pressed copy, and then I just pasted it over here. So I had 3 different pivot tables, and they're all using the same pivot cache. So they all refresh in sync. So basically I do Louisville, notice how all the other ones refresh in sync, etc. So I'm going to select in the first pivot table, and I'm going to select insert timeline date. Alright. And then at first it only connects to the first pivot table, even though these 3 pivot tables that I copied from the first one and pasted, they all use the same pivot cache. But this timeline slicer, when you create it initially, is only connected to the first one, even though they all use the same cache. So if you click on it and then select report connections up here under timeline, so you have to click on it, go to timeline, report connections, then you could connect the slicer to the other pivot tables on the sheet and press OK. So now when you adjust it, it'll affect all of the pivot tables on here, and that's how you do that. And obviously these pivot charts are built based off of the pivot tables, so now the pivot charts update when you change the pivot tables, because the pivot tables are based on the pivot charts. The pivot table charts are based on the pivot tables. So if you click in the pivot table, you can create a pivot chart by going to here, insert, and pivot chart. And I'm going to do a line table. Let me remove all the filters. Let me add like a few extra places. Let me add like 2014 in here. So that's like how you could create a pivot chart. There's actually a chapter for pivot charts and stuff, so I'll go into that in a little bit. So now I'm just going to do pivot table calculations. So go to the sample data. So calculated field, I'm going to show you calculations for the pivot tables. So the calculated field is a column you create by executing calculation against the existing columns in the pivot table. It's a virtual column. It doesn't change the data source, and it just gets like added on, and it contains data you'd find with a formula that interacts with the pivot table. So instead of doing like math on the side of the pivot table, you do math in the pivot table, so it changes. And if you remove columns and stuff, it'll move with the pivot table. And then the calculated item is like, you'll see it in a little bit. It's hard to visualize, but it's just a virtual row that takes up no space. So I'm going to work on the pivot table. So over here, click field list because it wasn't showing. Go to market and sum of sales amount and sum of contracted hours. And then over on pivot table analyze, I'm going to select fields, items, and sets. Calculate field. And I'm just going to name this like average dollar per hour. And I'm going to do, for the formula, I'm going to do equals sales amount. Let me delete the 0 because that's a constant, but you can have constants in there. Divided by contracted hours. Double click that. Press OK. So that's the sum of the average. So that's how you make like a calculated column. And notice how it shows up now in the pivot table fields. And it also shows up in the pivot table. You click here and change the name. Average dollar per hour already exists, so yeah. And so I'm going to create a calculated item by clicking in the pivot table, going over here, calculated item, and let me just change this around first. I'll do sales period, and so it's like period 1, period 2, and then sum of sales amount. So I'm going to click in here and then go to field, create a calculated item. And the first one is going to be average period 1 to period 8 or period 7. And I'm going to select equals average, and I'm going to put a comma in between each of these, and then put a parentheses over there. Press OK. So that adds the average of these 7 to the bottom of the pivot table. I'm going to make another calculated item. I'm going to call this average of period 8 to period 13. Press OK. So you get the two averages, and I guess you could filter out everything else besides the averages. So you just got the averages now. For the formulas, you could use average, if, or, and count, plus, divided by, concatenation, multiplication. But you could only reference the info in the pivot cache. You can't VLOOK up information. And what's annoying is, let me go over to product number and sum of sales amount, sum of contracted hours. So what's annoying about calculated fields is I'm going to create a calculated field. I'm just going to call this hours times sales. And then I'm just going to equals sum of sales amount. And I'm going to multiply that by contracted hours. Press OK. So what's annoying about the grand totals here with a calculated field is it doesn't add up. So say if I summed all those numbers up, it actually equals 331 million instead of that. So subtotals and grand totals don't work for calculated fields properly. So you just have to keep that in mind. So that's one drawback of calculated fields. But the usefulness of it is you get like this numbers, right? So you could do math with it, just the subtotals and the grand totals don't work. So if you go to insert and then over here, and then under the name drop down, you click here, and that's how you can modify the formulas that you have, the calculated fields. Just on home, insert, and then if I click delete here, press OK, it actually deletes that column. So now I'm going to do pivot charts. And pivot charts aren't individual piece of data or series of data like normal charts. They're items inside a larger pivot table object that create a chart on your worksheet. You can create pivot charts from scratch without a pivot table, but obviously that is more manual. So I'm going to do a pivot chart line chart. First, let me just make a pivot table with sales period as rows. Sum of sales amount as values, and columns as region. So this is like the ideal line chart setup. So I'm going to go to insert and pivot chart, and then do line, press OK. So that's how you create a pivot table across the sales periods. So got the periods across the bottom. So the rows are always the x-axis. The y-axis is always the columns. So the columns is always the y-axis, the rows is the x-axis in the pivot table, and then the values are just the lines themselves and this value. So basically, like the region, it becomes like the lines across the values and then across that. So keep in mind, that's like how you create a pivot chart. So limitations of pivot charts is you can't do scatter charts with them. XY scatter charts, stock charts, and trend lines disappear if you remove fields. But what's cool about them is they update as the pivot table changes as you refresh data, and you can also do filters with them. And so let me do a 2D column example with market and sales amount. And I'm going to go to insert pivot chart, 2D column, okay. So this has like the markets with the sales amounts. If you right click here, you go to move chart, and you can move the chart to a new sheet if you want, or you can move it to existing sheets. And even if you move it to a new sheet, it still works based on this pivot table. It's still linked to the original pivot table. So if you filter the pivot table, the chart updates too. And the pivot charts do not show subtotals or grandtotals, and it has filters in the pivot chart. So if I just want to see particular places, you can do that. And under field buttons, if you don't want to see the filter, you could remove the filter if you need to print and you don't want the filter there. And you could use slicers with pivot charts. So go to insert and slicer, and I could do, I guess, what is it, market. So you could do slicers with pivot charts. And then I showed you like the slicer can be attached to multiple pivot tables. So you could adjust multiple pivot tables with the slicer, and then you could have multiple charts connected to the pivot tables. So I'm going to do, let me do another example with region and market. And product description. So I'm going to make a 2D chart. Column chart, and I'm going to insert timeline slicers with invoice day, because these always use dates. And let me switch to years. Everything's in 2017, so yeah, that's how you could update with like timelines and stuff. And let's see how to make data bars. So I'm going to make sum of sales amount down here and product description there. So if you highlight everything here and then go to conditional formatting, data bars, enable, then it puts the data bars there. And then you go to conditional formatting, manage rules, and then click here, click edit rule, and then click show bars only. Press OK. So now it only shows the data bars there. So you could see how that changes over there also. And in the last section, I'm going to show you how to work with different data sources for pivot tables. So let me close out this chapter. And so external sources are multiple sources on different worksheets. So I'm going to bring up I'm going to go here and press Alt-DP to bring up the classic pivot table and pivot chart wizard. And I'm going to select multiple consolidation ranges. I'm going to select I will create the page fields, and I'm just going to select these. You include the headers in each of the selections, and then you press add. So I'm going to select the second one, press add, third one, press add. So they all have to have the same headers. And I'm going to select one. And for the first field, it's going to be north. Second field, it's going to be south. And the third data set range is going to be west. And now I'm going to press next, new worksheet, and finish. So this just made a pivot table with those three tables, and initially it just creates it with a count, but you could switch it over to sum. So you can get the sum based across these three tables. And also if you drag page 1 down here, so now I have north, south, and west separated by each of these days, separated by all of these products. And notice how line of business manager is converted to 0 because that is text values. So text values and date values automatically get converted to 0 for multiple consolidation pivot tables. But it's basically useful if you need if you need like math with 3 different tables or however many different tables. So now I'm going to show you how to work with data models in Excel to combine tables with relationships, similar to my Access Missing Manual Part 1 through 5. Part 1 and 2 show table relationships. So you can pull data from multiple sources. And I'm going to highlight the tables on transaction. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to press Control-Shift down on the keyboard and highlight from the top to the bottom. And I'm going to name this range transactions and then press enter. I'm going to do the same thing on the employee table. I'll name this employees and then press enter. And yeah, so I named both the tables before I created the pivot tables. Now I'm going to create pivot tables for both of them. Oh wait, shit. Delete that. Insert pivot table, and I'm going to click add this data to the data model. Press OK. And then under employees, I'm going to insert pivot table, add this data to the data model. So I added both those to the data model, and I'm going to select all under pivot table fields, and I'm going to put job title in rows and sum of sales amount from the other table and values. When you do that, it says relationships to a table may need to be created. I'm going to do create, and for the first table, which is transactions, I'm going to select sales rep, and for employees, I'm going to select employee number, and then I'm going to press OK. So now it basically made the relationship between the sales rep and the employee number, and in that relationship, employees was the primary key, employee number was the primary key, and sales rep was the foreign key. The primary key is unique, so employee numbers are unique, and the sales reps aren't unique, but they match. And then I basically just did the job title and the sub amount. So now I have all the unique job titles and then all the unique sum amounts. So that's how you can work with table relationships in pivot tables. If you want to learn more about that, you can watch my Access videos. Yeah, but for the primary key, for the employee numbers, it can't contain null values, blanks, and it can't have any duplicates, and they all have to be unique. And then if you want to edit relationships, you go to data and relationships. So here's the relationship that I just made, and you click new here if you want to make a new relationship. You click activate to enforce the relationship when aggregating and analyzing the data in the data model. Click deactivate to turn off the enforcement of the relationship. You could click delete to remove the relationship. So on the locations table, the locations worksheet in this workbook, I'm going to go to Insert and Table. I'm going to say my table has headers. Okay. So now I just created a table. And under Table Design, I'm just going to rename this table as Location. And press Enter. So if you go to Data, Existing Connections, and Location, you can select the Location table and click Open, and then click Only Create Connection, which will create the connection in the data model. So okay. So if I go back to here, now I have this table over here, and then obviously if I go to the data and relationships, I could create a new relationship between this new data table that I just added and the other tables if I needed to, but I don't need to. And if you go to Queries and Connections, and then I guess select Properties, you can see which one it is. This one's the Transactions one, this one's the Location one. So I'm going to just delete this because I don't need this anymore. Moving connection, we'll separate it from, yeah, okay. So that's how you could delete a connection. And then so now it's not, yeah, whatever. And then if you want to get from an Access database, you go just create a new sheet, go to get data from database from Microsoft Access database, and I'll do this database right here. And I'll do customer master. Yeah, so now I connected to the Access database. So you can't like change data here and have it update in Access, but say I'll go to Access right now. Like Access, you could pull like queries, you could pull tables from Access into Excel. So I just pulled the table customer master. So now if I just change this to like Meek, press Enter, and close it out, it obviously updates within Access. Nothing happened in Excel yet. But if I go to Data and refresh, so you can make the changes in Access, and then it'll actually change within Excel when you refresh it. And then obviously if you had like refresh on open, like I showed you in the beginning of the video, then the table would refresh when you open the sheet as long as changes were made in Access. And it's best to place the Access database in a shared network directory and don't rename or move the file. And then as long as it doesn't move locations, then when you're connected to an Access database table, it'll just refresh when you open that Excel workbook. Thank you for watching my video. I may make another pivot table video. I'm not sure though. I think I basically covered everything, but there's a few extra things I could cover.